guys, I'm Ruby, and today's video is the first video in a small series of videos reviewing The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. Ernest Becker was a psychologist who wrote this Pulitzer Prize winning book about the humankind's battle with the fear of death. And today's video is going to be part 1 on the depth psychology of heroism. I really hope you enjoy it.
Great men throughout the ages have been pondering the big questions, such as, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? And what, if anything, is human nature? Great philosophers like Nietzsche and Emerson said that our central calling and main task on this planet is the heroic. The psychologist William James said mankind's common instinct for reality has always held the world to be essentially a theater for heroism. Sigmund Freud discovered that each of us repeat the tragedy of the mythological Greek Narcissus, the son of the river god who fell in love with his own reflection. He was so obsessed with his reflection that he stared at it until he starved to death. Alfred Adler expands upon this view and says that our narcissism is intricately tied with our self-worth, and self-worth is essential for man to have a stable life. We see this most clearly in children who have not learned to repress this narcissism. These shamelessly make demands and compete for attention, as can be seen in sibling rivalry. This need to feel special, this desire to rise up above the masses and be recognized, doesn't disappear as we get older. Rather, it manifests itself in our ongoing struggle to rise through the ranks in whatever professional or social circle we may be in. This subconscious drive to heroism is the basis of creativity. It's what drives people to enlist in the army and also to seek out religious experience. In these processes, the individual seeks to live out the hero's journey, making the world a better place and to be recognized for their talents and contributions. Now, most people aren't aware of this drive towards heroism. However, if we peel away the layers of repression built up over the years, we can start to see that this drive to establish our self-worth in the form of a symbolic, heroic experience is at the core of the human condition. Now, here Becker theorizes that this heroism at the core of human experience is just one more layer we have created to repress something even deeper. And the hero's journey we all attempt in one way or another is actually a way to cope with the terror of death. There are two schools of thought on this subject. One side says we are born without the fear of death, and most of our early anxieties in life stem from attachment to the mother and fear of abandonment, until we learn about death later on in childhood. The other side believes every human is born with this fear. The psychologist William James referred to the fear of death as the worm at the core of man's effort to achieve happiness. To further explain this concept, he sums up the writings of the psychoanalyst Gregory Zilborg, who believed that the fear of death and man's instinct for self-preservation was a result of millions of years of biological evolution, and that ever-present fear of death must be repressed if man is to function properly. This repression begins in early childhood and can lead to recurrent nightmares and phobias of anything scary. Now, a vast majority of children grow up to live perfectly normal lives, and most people are able to repress the fear of death enough so that they are hardly aware that it is there. However, things can happen to trigger it to come to the surface, as can be seen in people's tendency to panic when confronted with impending natural disaster. We create many defense mechanisms to repress the underlying fear, such as narcissistic tendencies to increase one's self-worth and social standing, which is a symbolic way of feeling less vulnerable. When people lose this ability to repress the overwhelming anxiety of impending death, they have what are known as psychotic breaks. All of this forms the basis of man's existential dilemma. He is half animal and half symbolic. We have the ability to think and create. We have an individual identity and the ability to harness and overcome nature in so many ways. But we can never fully overcome nature, for we all die in the end. Everything man does in the symbolic world that he has created is an attempt to escape the grim reality of this existential dilemma. Viewed this way, everything that people do in their day-to-day lives is merely a shared delusion. He refers to this shared delusion as madness and says that this madness is inescapable. For if one were to escape this delusional madness, it would result in another form of madness. Or in other words, it's better to be part of the crazy world rather than the world think that you are crazy. Now, according to Freud, this process of repression starts when we are infants. One of the earliest processes he refers to is anality. When a child is born, they are fascinated by the strangeness of their own body. As the child develops, this fascination includes all of the body's functions, including its own feces. This is why young children are not repulsed and even play with their own feces. They learn through observation that their feces is repulsive to everyone else around them. Eventually, they themselves grow to be repulsed by it as well. We are repulsed by this very natural bodily function because it reminds us on a subconscious level that we are but animals trapped in a decaying body and ultimately we will one day die. This natural form of repression can be taken too far and can cause one to be described as anal. An anal retentive person is at great pains to make sure everything is in perfect order so that they may keep impending disaster at bay, and is thus another manifestation of the fear of death. Another manifestation of this repression is Freud's controversial Oedipal complex. This complex involves a male child's subconscious urge to compete with the father for possession of the mother. Freud believed that this was caused by an innate sexual desire towards the mother and the guilt caused by it. However, this view has been largely rejected. The Oedipal complex was later expanded upon and is now believed to be caused by the child's attempt to overcome his own passiveness and vulnerability. By defeating the father and possessing the mother, the child symbolically becomes the father of himself and thus conquers death. Similar to the Oedipal complex, the castration complex is the result of a child's attempt to repress his feeling of powerlessness. He does this by attempting to reject his dependence on the mother. The boy is disturbed when he learns of the female anatomy and their lack of a penis, and associates the vagina with dependence on the mother and their own powerlessness, which causes an irrational fear of being castrated and losing their genitals. This same exact rejection of dependence on the mother can manifest for the female child in the form of penis envy. The girl attempts to suppress her own vulnerability that she associates with the mother by striving to be more masculine. All of these complexes show that the process of repression begins in our infancy. As the child mind develops, they struggle in various ways to come to terms with their temporary body. Freud believed that if a child witnessed their parents having sex within the first 2 years of life, it could be a traumatizing event. The child's partially developed mind couldn't handle witnessing their parents partaking in the most primal of acts. After all, sex is how we procreate so that our species may live on in the light of our impending death. This is why there are so many varying repressions when it comes to our sexuality. We can see this collective repression in our repulsion at the thought of our parents' sex life, and also in the privacy in which we practice our own sexuality. In the first chapter of the book, he explains how striving toward the heroic is a drive at the core of the human experience. Why then is it so rare to see people acting courageously, as a hero would? The complexes we have just discussed from early childhood shine light on the answer. Fear is the cause of these complexes, and it is fear that can cause one to abandon the hero's journey. The psychologist Abraham Maslow referred to this abandonment as Jonas syndrome. Maslow says, "We fear our highest possibility as well as our lowest one. We are generally afraid to become that which we can glimpse in our most perfect moments. We enjoy and even thrill to the godlike possibilities we see in ourselves in such peak moments, and yet we simultaneously shiver with weakness, awe, and fear in the face of the same possibilities. We are just not strong enough to endure more." Humans battle with fear their entire lives. This battle starts in our infancy. By the time a majority of people have reached adulthood, they already have started to lose this battle with fear. They repress or deny the infinite possibilities of life because so many of those possibilities are bad. But this is a double-edged sword that cuts both ways. For although many possibilities are bad, many are good as well. However, there is no way to truly tell which are bad and which are good, so the person instead fears all possibility and avoids all knowledge and experience that reminds them of their own vulnerable smallness. The irony of being human is we are blessed with almost godlike potential through our ability to think on higher levels and create things, and to change the world that we live in, while simultaneously we are subject to all the suffering and cruelty that exists as part of our animal-like existence. As Becker so eloquently puts it, we are like gods that shit. Taking all this into account, we can start to see that most of the character man develops throughout life is actually developed as a defense mechanism to deal with the anxieties inherent to existing. Even people who are not mentally ill and are considered normal repress much of this fear to avoid many of the harsh truths of reality. The vast majority of us are living in this illusion that we have created to handle life. This illusion can constrict us and limit our possibilities. But what is the alternative? If we were to fully let go of the illusion, we may be able to overcome some of the issues they create, but the cost would be genuine despair. It would make thoughtless living impossible and leave one a trembling animal at the mercy of the entire cosmos. Otto Rank said, "Every human being is equally unfree. That is, we create out of freedom a prison. We create this prison to deal with the dread of death and the overwhelmingness of life. If we failed to make this prison, we would be viewed as crazy. In fact, the schizophrenic person suffers from this inability to create the illusion. They are so overwhelmed by possibility that they can no longer function in society. The irony of man's condition is that the deepest need is to be free of the anxiety of death and annihilation, but it is life itself that awakens it, and so we must shrink from being fully alive." Here he takes a look at the much earlier works of Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard has ideas that were much ahead of his time and were mostly misunderstood until modern-day psychology came about. His view is a blend of psychology and religion. In his works, he describes the biblical fall from paradise in very similar terms as the more modern-day psychoanalysts that we have already mentioned. At first, when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, they were not yet self-conscious. They then ate the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They became self-aware as a result, and God says to them, "Thou shalt surely die." This leads them to be kicked out of paradise. Or in other words, the terror that comes about as a result of self-consciousness is the knowledge of one's death. Man is alone in the animal kingdom in this peculiar anxiety. Kierkegaard's theory that a character is developed as a defense against the anxieties inherent to life holds up well in the view of the post-Freudian psychoanalysts. He also warns against being overprotective of our children and unconsciously passing along our underlying anxieties and repressions. Instead, he claims that allowing a child a certain amount of leeway to explore the world and come to their own conclusions allows them to develop their own unique repressions and avoids causing the complexes that Freud later described in detail. His theory also explains why so many people forsake finding greater meaning in life and instead distract themselves with trivial pursuits. Greater meaning involves examining greater possibilities of what life could be. With greater possibility comes greater anxiety. Most people would rather avoid that anxiety than fearlessly face it. This is why so many people take the beaten path that is laid out by society. Here is where his theory really starts to get interesting. We have already established that in normal circumstances, our character is developed as a way to cope with life. Although this is pathological, or in other words, delusional, it is at least the normal amount of delusion that everyone in society is operating under. If the amount of delusion becomes abnormal when compared to the rest of society, the individual would be viewed as mentally ill. Take not having any delusion whatsoever, for example. In this case, the person would be overwhelmed by the infinite possibilities of life. The symbolic self that exists in their mind can be swept away by the overwhelming significance of every trivial detail of life, that they lose sight of reality and the very real limitations of their body. This causes the personality to split. Today we call this schizophrenia. Instead of grounding themselves in reality, they get completely lost in the fantasy world that they have created in their mind. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, if one had entirely too much delusion, they would suffer from an extreme lack of possibilities. They would become overwhelmed by their circumstances and be unable to imagine a way in which they could possibly escape their current situation. Today, we refer to this state as depression. Most people operate under a normal amount of neurosis and are able to navigate their way through life exploring a manageable amount of possibility. Many types of characters can develop under normal neurosis. Here he makes note of the two extreme ends of this character development. On one end, you have the introvert who mostly keeps to themselves. They appear normal in many aspects, and their attempt to overcome this existential problems happens symbolically within their own mind. They strive to learn, grow, and to find higher meaning. Their heroic journey happens internally. Now, the other extreme attempts to overcompensate for their fears by attempting to take control of the world around them by force. These types are the doers rather than the thinkers. This extreme usually happens on a small scale and is relatively harmless. However, on rare occasions, one can become obsessed with power. This can quickly lead to terrible things. Kierkegaard refers to this as demonic obsession. In both cases, they are symbolically overcoming their fear by encapsulating it in a tangible goal that they can achieve in real life. Viewed this way, a person's unique character develops as a result of the unique combination of lies that they tell themselves about reality. In this sense, much of what we consider mental health is just sorting out the lies we tell ourselves and discarding the ones that don't work. Is there a better alternative? Kierkegaard's answer is yes, there is. If we abandon the life lies, there is no doubt that this will lead to despair. After all, that would involve abandoning our character, everything we are identified with. This would leave one feeling lost, On top of that, we would be left staring death in the face as our repressions are abandoned along with our character. Now, as frightening as this may seem, this, he says, is exactly what needs to happen. Only by confronting this harsh truth and contending with this despair can we ever hope to transcend it. We transcend it by developing some kind of faith. Religious thinking encapsulates this idea perfectly. The religious types overcome the fear of their own mortality and contend with the near infinite possibility of life by having faith that a creator is underlying it all and is guiding them. This faith also gives their temporary life meaning. In less religious terms, this same thing happens in the process of striving towards heroism. In this process, one breaks the chains that bound them to their normal life in society. They abandon the character lie and are left with their true inner selves. They embrace their urge to rise up and prove their own significance to the world. This gives life a new meaning and can leave one feeling connected to the world, perhaps by fate or destiny. This is where the realm of religion and spirituality merge with the realm of psychology and science. Many years later, when Sigmund Freud established his theories, they confirmed what Kierkegaard was writing about almost 100 years later. Kierkegaard, however, was writing from a religious viewpoint, whereas Freud largely rejected religion and grouped it in with many other forms of occultism. Freud, in a sense, was engaged in his own obsession towards heroism. He believed in his own genius and felt that he needed no God to explain what was at work in the human mind. Freud understood the existential dilemma perhaps better than anyone, but it is widely believed that his theory that the innate sexuality and aggression in children as the root cause of this dilemma was an error. It was rejected by his colleagues, which include Jung, Adler, and Rank. Although many of Freud's theories have been discarded, he revolutionized the field of psychology and paved the way for many of the theories we have today. Much later in Freud's life, he started to acknowledge the existential fear of death as a much bigger factor in the development of the psyche. Many people have attempted to analyze Freud's psyche, and many believe that he largely suppressed not only his fear of death, but also the inherent drives to seek out religious or heroic experiences that allow one to symbolically overcome death by achieving some sort of immortality. This suppression led to his own neuroses, which he then analyzed himself, and this in turn greatly helped him in developing many of his theories. It is noted that although he remained atheist, he did have many superstitions that he followed as a way to quell the death anxiety. In the later part of his life, the suppression of the death fear started to become unraveled, as can be seen in two famous accounts of Freud suddenly fainting when some of his colleagues brought up a topic of conversation related to death. Freud's genius allowed him to rise through the ranks in society and become a famous professor and well-respected member of the international academia. In this sense, he became a much greater figure than the rest of his family, including his father. It seems as if Freud's obsession with his own genius and furthering his influence was his own attempt to become an immortal figure in history. As if he suffered from his own Oedipal complex, and all of his works were an attempt to symbolically become the father of himself, his own immortal creation. In this sense, it's no wonder he thought the Oedipal complex was the core dilemma of humanity. It was his core dilemma, and he mistakenly transferred his own issues onto his patients. What Freud despised more than anything was helplessness. Hence, the rejection of the dependency on his parents, which was a constant reminder of this helplessness we are born into. He yearned for fame and hoped through fame he could create his own immortality. Immortality meaning being loved by many anonymous people and living in esteem of men yet unborn for the works that you have contributed to the betterment of their lives. In order to avoid this helplessness at all costs, it was imperative that Freud could stand on his own as an individual. He could not bring himself to rely on his family, his colleagues, other people's theories, or even the idea of God. This need for independence is perhaps why he never let go of his theory of sexuality in children as the primary cause of all neuroses, when most of his contemporaries had already rejected the idea and put forth the better explanation of the fear of death as the most primal of causes.